In front of the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in Washington, D.C., is an amazing statue of Don Quixote. He's in his armor, on his horse, lance in hand. What a good and inspirational statue to have in our nation's capital. And what a wonderful musical to use in our God on Broadway service. One doesn't have to be a theologian or a biblical scholar to see the parallels between Quixote and Christ. Both men believed that the world could be and should be a better place. Both believed we should be working to make it better. Both men were courageous. Both were thought to be fools and foolish. And both men were on a quest. We're all on a quest. The question is, what kind of quest? The quest is always interesting and meaningful if we are open to the movement of God's Spirit. The quest will have a sense of wonder and awe and surprise about it. Linda Combs is in charge of our sets and costumes for our God on Broadway services. Hasn't she done a fabulous job? Linda didn't go to church for many, many years. In the early 1990s, she somehow wandered into this place and never left. I mean, literally never left. She never went home. She's been working here constantly ever since, or at least it seems that way. Linda was born and raised in Savannah. One of her first jobs was working as a cashier at the Winn-Dixie on Habersham Street. Now it's a red and white. I grew up between Habersham and Abercorn on 65th Street, went to Jacob G. Elementary Schools. I rode my bike or walked there every day, and I went past the Winn-Dixie every day, would go into the store at least twice a week. Never knew Linda. But here we are, many years later, on the corner of Henry and Waters, and she's been a great big part of this church's renewal and revitalization. The quest becomes an amazing and curious adventure when God is involved. Jonathan Rabb and Don Cohen, our Quixote and Sancho, weren't they incredible? Jonathan and Don met each other for the first time a week ago. At one time, they were both performers in New York City. And on the night they met here at the church, they discovered that both had lived in Manhattan at the same time pursuing their careers, lived about 6 blocks from each other, but met for the first time in Savannah, Georgia, on the corner of Henry and Waters. 2 Jewish folks showing a bunch of Christian folks how to be Christian. Which makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because that's who taught the Gentiles in the first place. The quest is full of surprises, isn't it? Especially when you try to be open and sensitive to the movement of God's Spirit. One of my favorite characteristics of both Quixote and Christ is that they were always offering people hope. The Apostle Paul said, faith, hope, and love abide, these three. These are the 3 greatest things. The greatest, of course, he said, is love, but hope is right up there too. What are we without hope? Without hope, we're in big trouble. Without hope, we cannot go on. Hope is the bridge that takes us to tomorrow. Both Quixote and Christ would have us know that no matter how difficult your situation is, there is hope. Always hope. And the writer of Don Quixote, Cervantes, wants us to realize this so desperately that he sets his story in the most depressing of situations, the Spanish Inquisition. He sets it in a dungeon where people are waiting on their probable execution. It can't get any more depressing or more hopeless than that. It is in this setting that Quixote says, "For neither good nor evil can last forever." And so it follows that as evil has lasted a long time, good must now be close at hand. So both Quixote and Christ were hope cultivators. Cultivate hope for yourself, for your life, and cultivate hope for others and their lives. It's what takes us to tomorrow. Another one of my favorite common characteristics of Quixote and Christ is that they help people realize how great they are, how special they are, how loved they are, how valuable they are. One of our biblical texts today is the story from the Gospel of Mark about the woman who washed Jesus' feet with expensive ointment. The story's told in all 4 chapters, but they're told very differently. In this particular story, the woman does not have a name. And the disciples, of course, get mad at her and they berate her. Now, I mentioned the woman doesn't have a name. It's common in many biblical stories that the women in the stories are nameless. Naming someone meant they were someone. It gave them power. And so by not having names, these women were considered to be nobodies. The same is true about the Samaritan woman Jesus met at a well, or the woman Jesus prevented from being stoned to death. In all 3 of these situations, he lifts them up, lets them know they are a child of God. Be it prostitutes or tax collectors like Matthew or Zacchaeus, or people with leprosy and other diseases, he was constantly lifting them up, not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally. He was letting them know that although they were not valued by others and by their culture, they were valued by God, their Creator. And I hope every person here knows how great you are, and how loved you are, and how valued you are by God, your Creator who made you. And like Quixote and Christ, I hope you will let others know how loved and valued they are. In Man of La Mancha, Quixote lifts up Aldonza, of course, a peasant barmaid with quite the reputation. And what's the first thing he does? He names her. He gives her a beautiful name, Dulcinea. Aldonza doesn't understand this man who treats her with dignity and with respect and love. And she says, "Why do you do these things?" "What things?" he says. "These ridiculous things you do." In our culture, being a Quixote, being a Christ, appears foolish. I've said it a million times. People may wonder about the clowns we have as our church logo, but it's the perfect symbol for Christianity, because in many cases, the teachings of Christ appear foolish to the world. The prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures were thought to be off their rocker, madmen. We can claim to be a Judeo-Christian country, but our country doesn't follow the ways of Christ and the old prophets. If we were, we wouldn't be putting all of these ribbons on the fence for people being killed by guns. If we were, we wouldn't have people starving to death or homeless. Quixote says, when life itself seems lunatic, who knows where madness lies? Perhaps to be too practical is madness. To surrender dreams, this may be madness. Too much sanity may be madness. And maddest of all, to see life as it is and not as it should be. So know that following the way of Christ may make you look foolish to others, even to family and friends. Sometimes especially to family and friends. For you see, as much as I love the statue of Don Quixote in Washington, it's not my favorite statue of him. My favorite one is in Madrid, Spain. I would love to see it one day in person. Right in the heart of the city is this huge, towering stone sculpture of Cervantes, the author, sitting in a chair. It's kind of like the Lincoln Memorial, huge. He's sitting in a chair, and out in front of him is a beautiful bronze statue of Don Quixote in his armor, on a horse, with his lance. But that's not all. He's not alone. Beside him, a much shorter bronze statue, because he's either on a shorter horse or a mule, is Sancho. And that's who I really want to ask the question, why do you do the things that you do? I mean, Sancho, why are you doing everything for this man? Why are you taking care of him that way? Why are you being his servant? Why are you giving your life to him? I mean, without you, Sancho, there would be no Quixote. And yet Quixote gets all the credit, all the notoriety. He gets the title of the book. He gets the best songs in the show. He gets a statue in front of the Kennedy Center. But without you, Sancho, there's no Quixote. Why do you put up with it? Why do you do the things you do? In a song in the show, Sancho says he does it because he likes Quixote. That may be part of it. But there's got to be more. There are a lot of people I like that I wouldn't be halfway devoted to. The only thing I can think of is that maybe one day Sancho opened up a Bible and read the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, the part about the disciples arguing with each other about who is greatest. And then Jesus sits them down and says, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. What's the most difficult instrument to play? The most difficult instrument to play, of course, is second fiddle. It's the most difficult role to play because one must have control over one's ego, which seems to always get in the way. Not too many people in our country are willing to play second fiddle. The statue in Madrid is the one we need in our nation's capital. It's the statue we need in every city and in every church, the one with Sancho reminding us that we are called to be the servant of all. This week, church member Mary Polward, sent me an interesting story about a man who was both a Quixote and a Sancho, and you may have seen it. I think it's starting to make its rounds on the internet. Stories about a man named Peter Norman. Peter was an Australian runner in the 200-meter race in the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. He was only 5 feet 6 inches tall. a relatively unknown runner, wasn't expected to do very well. Somehow he surprised everyone by running an amazing semifinal in just over 20 seconds. Only the two Americans, Tommy the Jet Smith and John Carlos, had done better. It seemed as if the victory would be decided in the finals between the two Americans. Somehow, Peter ran the race of his life, improving on his time again, his best performance ever. His time was an Australian record that still stands today, 47 years later. But that record wasn't good enough to come in first, because Tommy Smith was really the jet that day and set a new world record. Peter came in second, silver medal, and John Carlos, the other American, came in third, the bronze. But the race is not as memorable as what happened at the award ceremony. After all, and after I tell you what happened, those of you who were alive in 1968 will say to yourself, oh yeah, I remember that. 1968 was the year that both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, both African American, decided they would make a statement for civil rights during the award ceremony. The two men stood barefooted on the podium, their heads bowed, a black gloved fist in the air as the national anthem was played. Many of you have probably seen the famous photograph of them. Standing beside them in the picture is Peter. You hardly notice him, but I remember seeing Peter on the podium and wondering what that little white guy who came in second place thought about all of this. Was he upset? Did it bother him that the two Americans were drawing this attention? What was going on? Well, here's the story behind the story. Peter was from Australia, which had strict apartheid laws, almost as strict as South Africa. Before the award ceremony, the two Americans, Tommy and John, asked Peter if he believed in human rights. Peter said that he did. Then they asked him if he believed in God, and Peter, who had been in the Salvation Army, said he strongly believed in God. John Carlos would later say, "We knew that what we were going to do was far greater than any athletic feat. And Peter said to us, 'I'll stand with you.' I expected to see fear in his eyes, but all I saw was love." And so Tommy and John decided to get up on the podium wearing the Olympic Project for Human Rights badge, a movement of athletes in support of the battle for equality. They would receive their medals barefoot, representing the poverty facing people of color. They would wear the famous black gloves, a symbol of the Black Panthers' cause. But before going up on the podium, they realized they only had one pair of gloves. "Take one each," Peter suggested to them. And that's what they did. But then Peter did something else. He said, "I believe in what you believe. Do you have another one of those badges that I can wear?" Referring to the Olympic Project for Human Rights badge. "That way I can show my support for your cause." Tommy Smith remembers being astonished, thinking, "Who is this white Australian guy? He won his silver medal. Can't he just take it and that be enough?" Someone loaned Peter a badge to wear. The three men went out on the field and got up on the podium, and the rest is history. The head of the American delegation vowed that these American athletes would pay the price their entire lives for that gesture, a gesture he thought had nothing to do with the sport. Tommy and John were immediately suspended from the American Olympic team and expelled from the Olympic Village. When they got back home, the two men faced heavy repercussions and death threats. But time, in the end, proved that they had been right. And they eventually became champions in the fight for human rights. With their image restored, they collaborated with the American team of athletics, and a statue of them was erected at San Jose State University. Peter Norman is absent from this statue. His absence from the podium step seems like an epitaph of a hero that no one ever noticed. A forgotten athlete deleted from history, even in Australia, his own country. 4 years later, at the 1972 Summer Olympics, Peter wasn't part of the Australian sprinters team, even though he had run qualifying times for the 200-meter race 13 times and the 100-meter race 5 times. In Australia, he was treated like an outsider, his family like outcasts, and work was impossible for him to find. John Carlos would say, if we were getting beat up in America, Peter was facing an entire country and suffering alone. For years, Peter had only one chance to save himself. He was invited to condemn his co-athletes and condemn their gesture in exchange for a pardon from the system that condemned him. A pardon would allow him to find a stable job through the Australian Olympic Committee and be part of the organization of the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. But Peter never gave in. He was the greatest Australian sprinter in history, holder of the 200-meter record, yet he wasn't even invited to the Olympics in Sydney. Peter died suddenly from a heart attack in 2006 without his country ever apologizing for their treatment of him. At his funeral, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, friends since that moment in 1968, were his pallbearers, carrying his coffin and sending him off as a hero. There are Quixotes and Sanchos in this world. And I pray that you and I can be one of them. We may not get a statue. And people may ask, why do you do the things you do? It really doesn't matter, does it? As long as we're following the call of God's Spirit, as long as we're following the quest. What matters is that we dream the impossible dream, that we fight the unbeatable foe. We right the unrightable wrong. Then, my friend, you shall be peaceful and calm as you are laid to your rest. And the world will be better for you.